Louis XIV is France's most famous king, known for the opulence of Versailles, wars, and influence over Europe. But his reign was not all brilliance. It was also a series of scandals, intrigues, and secret conspiracies. Louis XIV became King of France when he was only 5 years old, but instead of luxurious palaces and honor, he saw chaos, rebellion, and betrayal. He did not dream of a golden carriage or fancy balls. He dreamed of simply surviving. From childhood, Louis knew he was in danger of death. There was a civil war in the country, the nobility fought for power, and the common people hated the king. Rebels time after time captured Paris, and the royal family was forced to flee. At the age of 6, Louis for the first time was on the verge of life and death. Every night, the little king fell asleep in his clothes and shoes, because at any moment he could be awakened by shouts, "Run!" He did not know where he would wake up in the morning, in the palace or in a damp carriage rushing from the besieged city. Once he was indeed awakened in the middle of the night. His mother grabbed him by the arm and forced him to run into the darkness to escape the angry Parisians. The worst moment in the king's childhood happened in 1648. Paris was in revolt, and armed rebels broke into the palace. They burst into the king's chambers, demanding that little Louis show himself, but he hid under the bed. Ludovic trembled with fear, afraid to give himself away even by breathing. He was only 10 years old, but he already knew the fear of death. The rebels left his room, but this moment remained in his memory forever. He never again trusted the aristocracy or the common people. The fear of his childhood made Louis ruthless. He realized that either he ruled France or France would kill him. That's why he became an absolute monarch who tolerated no disobedience. He turned Versailles into a golden prison. The king built a luxurious palace, but not for comfort, but to control the nobility, keeping them away from Paris and riots. But that was just the beginning. Louis XIV was not only a powerful king, but also a man who couldn't resist beautiful women. His official wife was the Spanish princess Maria Theresa, but in reality she played almost no role in his life. The real power was in the hands of his mistresses. These women didn't just entertain the king, they ruled France, made alliances, took out enemies, and even resorted to black magic. The most famous favorite of Louis XIV is Madame de Montespan. She was not just a beautiful woman, but also an incredibly clever schemer. For the sake of power, she was ready for anything. When the king began to lose interest in her, she began attending secret black masses. At these rituals, sacrifices were made, the blood of babies was used, and spells were recited to win back the king's love. And this is not a myth. Documents of the time confirm Madame de Montespan's participation in these rituals. But even magic couldn't keep Louis forever. When the king grew cold to her, she became enraged. It was rumored that she was the one who ordered the poison for her rival, but her plan was discovered. As a result, Madame de Montespan fell into disgrace and was forced to leave the court. The king had another favorite who literally ruled foreign policy. It was Mademoiselle de la Vallière. Officially, she was just the king's mistress, but in reality, she secretly interfered in politics. For example, historians claim that she was the one who influenced Louis's decision to go to war with Holland. She convinced him that France should seize more territory and that an alliance with England would help him achieve victory. Diplomats wondered why the king suddenly changed his mind, not realizing that the real negotiations were taking place not in the throne room, but in the king's bedroom. The king, who was considered the most powerful monarch in Europe, was in fact dependent on his mistresses. Their influence on politics was greater than that of many ministers. At the end of the 17th century, deaths in France became more frequent, and not because of wars or disease, but because everyone could fall victim to poison. Not only enemies, but also friends, relatives, lovers, and even kings were poisoned. It all started when rich and noble people in France suddenly began to die. Some curled up in terrible pain, others simply fell asleep and never woke up again. There were no signs of violence and the doctors were just throwing up their hands. But it soon became clear that these deaths were no accident. Court ladies, priests, and even royal doctors were at the center of the conspiracy. Women who wanted to get rid of old husbands, aristocrats who wanted to eliminate their rivals, mistresses who were fed up with their rivals. All of them bought deadly powders from secret poisoners. The main suspect was Catherine Monvoisin, fortune-teller and alchemist who supplied the nobility with poisons. She told how to use them properly, to put them in wine, add them to food, or even drip them on clothes. Rumors of the poisons reached Louis XIV himself, and he began to investigate. His brother, Philip of Orleans, had always been more popular than Louis at court. Many courtiers thought he could have been a better king. In 1701, Philippe died suddenly. Historians still argue whether it was a natural death or poisoning. There is a version that Louis XIV himself ordered his removal so as not to risk his throne. He ruled the country harshly, but perhaps he himself played by the rules of the killers. After all, if you don't kill first, they'll kill you. Versailles was not just a palace, but a breeding ground for deadly intrigue. Courtiers smiled at each other, drank wine, and danced at balls, but each of them could become the next victim of poison. Every nobleman dreamed of going to Versailles, but no one realized that it meant losing their freedom forever. Louis XIV knew that the nobles were his greatest threat. They could conspire, support riots, or even overthrow him. To prevent this from happening, he made the nobles live at court. Versailles was set up so that nobles couldn't leave without permission. If you disappeared for even a couple of days, the king simply dropped you from his list of cronies. It meant the end of career, wealth, and influence. Life at Versailles was governed by strict rules. Everything from clothing to mealtimes was decided by the king. For years, nobles competed for the right to simply hand him a shirt or hold a candlestick. It was not an honor, it was a way to humiliate the aristocrats and show that without the king they were nothing. The Grand Versailles hid a horrifying truth. It had no toilets. The nobility, dressed in lavish gowns and wigs, used corridors, staircases, and even balconies instead of restrooms. To mask odors, scented candles and buckets of rose petals were placed throughout the palace, but it didn't help. Eyewitnesses said that in summer the corridors of Versailles literally stank. Some noblemen had servants who carried special night pots for them, but even this did not save, because the guests in the palace were thousands, and every day arranged balls, feasts, and meetings. But the king found another way to remind everyone who was in charge. He made the nobles watch him eat. Every day there was a royal dinner ceremony in the palace. The nobles would stand silently around the table and watch the king eat. He ate slowly, emphatically important, enjoying the fact that his meal was an entire event. Sometimes he would make a gesture and throw a piece of meat or a slice of bread to someone. This was considered the highest honor. Even if the person wasn't hungry, they were obliged to eat a handout from the king. Louis did not just rule France, he created a whole system of psychological control, where every aristocrat was afraid to take a step aside without the king's approval. Louis XIV reigned for 72 years, longer than any other monarch in Europe. As a young man, he was a majestic, vigorous king, feared and respected. But in his last years, he became old, sickly, and lonely. He had gotten used to all of France living by his rules. But time was passing, and even the Sun King could not stop the inevitable. By the end of his life, Louis XIV had lost almost all of his relatives. His son, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren died before him, from disease, poisoning, and war. Only one heir remained, a 5-year-old great-grandson, who did not realize what fate awaited him. But despite the personal tragedies, the king did not change. Even when he was in his 70s, he demanded that the nobles get up at dawn to see him wake up and then follow him around the palace all day. One of his strange orders. No one was allowed to wear black. The king was afraid of old age and death, so he didn't want to see reminders of mourning around him. Even if someone's family was dying, they had to wear brightly colored clothes or risk falling into disfavor. But the more he clung to power, the more the people hated him. France was bankrupted by endless wars, taxes were rising, and ordinary people lived in poverty. In 1715, Louis XIV became seriously ill. His leg began to rot because of an infection, but the court doctors were afraid to tell him the truth. No one dared to suggest amputation. The king was sure that he was immortal and did not allow serious surgery. For weeks he was in hellish pain, but no one could help him. The most powerful king in Europe died in agony, surrounded by servants who waited for his last breath. As his body lay in his coffin, the news spread through Paris. He was dead at last. The people no longer feared him. There were shouts of joy in the churches because people saw him not as a great monarch, but as a symbol of suffering and taxes. Louis XIV built his life to appear immortal, but his death was a reminder that even the most powerful people cannot escape fate. He left France a magnificent Versailles and a ruined treasury. His style of government became a model for many dictators of the future. Absolute power, a cult of personality, and complete suppression of opposition.